The Trespasser, by Omar Cuellar. Jeremy, at the age of 19, had long since come to the unsettling realization that he was not like other men. He was, in some ineffable way, a trespasser upon the sanctity of human habitations, a silent interloper who derived a peculiar, almost eldritch satisfaction from venturing into the dwellings of others in their absence. This singular proclivity had taken root in his soul when he was but 8 years old, a tender age at which his young mind first succumbed to the strange and ineffable allure of New England's antique architecture. He found himself drawn, with an almost unholy reverence, to the facades of colonial, Dutch, Georgian, and federal-style houses, their silent facades whispering to him of lost centuries and forgotten lives. At first, he dared only to tread the perimeters of these venerable structures, lingering hesitantly in their unfenced front gardens like a wraith unsure of its own purpose. It was at 15 that he first beheld the house that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. Unlike the others, which merely charmed him with their elegance, this house enthralled him with a spectral beauty beyond words. He would stand, entranced, at the far side of the street, drinking in the sight of its time-worn exterior with a fixation bordering on madness. This house, this nameless, haunting edifice, was in Montpelier, Vermont, the city of his birth. And it was here, within its forsaken halls, that Jeremy first crossed the threshold from idle fascination to clandestine transgression. The moment he stepped across that unhallowed boundary, he knew, with the certainty of one who has glimpsed his true purpose, that he had been born for this. The act of trespass was no mere thrill, no passing curiosity, but a calling that resonated deep within his being. From that day forth, he would forever walk the shadowed corridors of houses not his own, a silent shade moving through the lives of others, unseen and unknown. He could not explain the compulsion that gripped him, nor could he ascribe it to any of the common motives that drove men to violate the sanctity of private dwellings. He had heard, read, and seen on television that those who trespassed upon the homes of others did so with base and venal intent, seeking money, valuables, narcotics, or other sordid prizes. There were even those whose inclinations ran to depths of true depravity, intruding not for theft, but for violence and unspeakable cruelty. Yet Jeremy was neither a thief nor a murderer. The houses themselves called to him, not for what they contained, but for what they were. He entered them not to possess, nor to destroy, but simply to be within, to bask in the mute presence of their silent interiors. He knew not why, nor to what end, at least not until a future hour, when his 19th year would bring with it a revelation beyond his present understanding. At 15, when he first transgressed the threshold of that house whose spectral beauty had so long enthralled him, he was overcome by a strange and profound serenity. The living room stood empty of human presence, its former occupants now absent, and in that vacancy, Jeremy felt an inexplicable sense of dominion. Was it merely the heady thrill of possession, the mind's primitive response to an unchallenged claim? He entertained such a notion but found it ultimately unsatisfying, for the truth ran deeper than any simple thirst for control. As he wandered those hushed chambers, his gaze lingered upon the walls, the ceilings, the time-worn furniture, the carpets thick with forgotten dust, and the strange assemblage of decorations whose meanings had long since faded into oblivion. Yet he did not regard them as the mundane furnishings of a human abode. No, he beheld them as one might behold relics from an alien world, things at once familiar and ineffably distant, as though glimpsed through the distorting lens of some unnatural dream. It was as if his very presence among them was an aberration, as though he were some nameless thing intruding upon a reality not his own. And in that moment, an unspoken, unsettling realization began to stir within him, one that he could not yet name, but that would, in time, come to define the course of his existence. Jeremy was well aware that there were others his age who intruded upon the homes of strangers, but their motives were crude and puerile, acts of bravado to impress their peers, dares undertaken to settle foolish wagers, or the mere intoxication of trespassing against society's prohibitions. Such trivial excitements held no allure for him. He did not creep through silent corridors for the thrill of eluding discovery, nor did he fear the eyes of homeowners, neighbors, or even the police. The judgments of others were to him as meaningless as the murmur of the wind against shuttered windows. What mattered was the absence of human presence, the singular and sacred stillness that allowed him to behold a house in its truest form, untainted by the restless intrusion of its inhabitants. A question had long haunted him. How did rooms, living rooms, kitchens, chambers of rest and bathing, exist when unobserved by their owners? What subtle and unrecorded transformations took place in the hush of uninhabited spaces? He had never been able to banish the peculiar notion that houses possessed a secret, hidden life of their own, one that could only be glimpsed when the burden of human occupation was lifted. And so, whenever he crossed the forbidden threshold of a new dwelling, he moved with reverence, his steps hushed and deliberate, as though in silent obeisance to an unspoken ritual. There were times when he would pause at the threshold of each room, standing as still as the very furniture itself, straining his senses in the hope of detecting that which the rightful occupants could never perceive. He believed that in their constant distractions, their endless entanglements of toil, children, education, and idle entertainments, they were blind to the deeper essence of the places they called home. The true nature of a house could only be perceived in moments of absolute quiet, when the walls breathed in the hush of solitude, and the unseen forces that lurked in forgotten corners might, for a fleeting instant, reveal themselves to the one who listened. Jeremy harbored no belief in ghosts, nor did his clandestine incursions stem from any foolish desire to commune with spectral entities. He had no interest in the vainglorious pursuits of so-called ghost hunters, if indeed such phantoms truly existed. To him, such notions were mere drivel, the childish fancies of minds eager to impose myth upon the unknown. And yet, if there was anything in his nocturnal wanderings that evoked the presence of the departed, it was not the whisper of disembodied spirits, but the solemn, unblinking gazes of the dead, portraits of recently deceased souls, hung with somber reverence upon walls or placed in quiet memorial upon nightstands. Each time he chanced upon such a photograph and later discovered, through whispered gossip or careful inquiry, that the subject had but recently passed from the mortal coil, an involuntary shudder would seize him. There was something in those fixed and lifeless eyes, something not wholly explainable, as though the very essence of the departed lingered within the ink and paper, watching, waiting. But how did Jeremy acquire such knowledge? How did he come to learn, with dreadful certainty, the names and fates of those whose homes he invaded? The answer was as simple as it was unnerving. Over the years, he had honed his craft to an art, becoming an unseen observer of the lives around him. He studied with methodical precision the routines of his neighbors and the local townsfolk, charting their comings and goings, their tastes and inclinations, their familial bonds and social entanglements. What had begun as the heedless curiosity of youth soon became a discipline of silent vigilance. At first, he had been careless, an amateur in the art of clandestine observation. Fortune had spared him from capture, yet instinct warned him that recklessness would one day lead to betrayal, to discovery. And so he refined his methods, his patience deepening into something almost unnatural. Before setting foot within a new dwelling, he ensured, through meticulous inquiry, that its inhabitants were far removed, at school, at work, at the market, or attending some sacred ritual at the local church. He did not merely confirm their absence but calculated the precise span of time he would have before their inevitable return. Only then, when he was certain that the house stood utterly abandoned, did he dare to cross its forbidden threshold, stepping into that silent dominion where walls, ceilings, furniture, and carpets lay untouched beneath the weight of solitude. And as always, with each intrusion, a singular and unshakable question gnawed at the edges of his mind, one that had long haunted his waking thoughts but had yet to yield its terrible answer. What was it, truly, that lurked within these empty spaces when no human eye remained to see? Jeremy knew, with an unsettling certainty, that he was a social deviant. Yet his deviation was neither sociopathic nor psychopathic. It was something far more profound, something cosmic. His was not the mundane aberration of the criminal or the madman, but rather the quiet estrangement of one who had glimpsed, however faintly, the vertiginous gulf beyond the veil of human perception. As he wandered through the silent chambers of the houses he invaded, his steps cautious, his breath hushed, There were moments when he ceased to be himself. His name, his past, his very sense of self would slip away like sand through grasping fingers, and for a time, he would exist only as a nameless presence adrift in the shifting geometries of an unfamiliar reality. The walls, once solid and inert, would begin to ripple and contort, their angles no longer obedient to the Euclidean constraints of the waking world. He would watch, transfixed, as alien shapes slid unnaturally across the surfaces, warping and undulating as though stirred by some unseen, cosmic tide. And above him, where the ceiling should have been, there would stretch a firmament of unknowable vastness, dark and infinite, punctuated by the erratic flicker of stars that moved in impossible trajectories before dissolving, dripping downward in slow, spectral rivulets like some unholy celestial rain. These occurrences were no longer isolated incidents. Each time he crossed the threshold of a new house, the sensations deepened. Disorientation would seize him more swiftly. His name would vanish from his mind, only to return moments later like a whispered secret from a distant past. The furniture, once inert and commonplace, would pulse with a strange, internal light, flickering like dying stars on the verge of collapse. And then would come the colors, phantasmal bursts of brilliance that moved with an intelligence of their own, brushing against his shoulders, his head, his very eyes with a spectral touch that sent shudders through his being. He dared not let them touch him fully. Some instinct, primal and insurmountable, warned that to be consumed by those shifting hues would bring about some unspeakable dissolution. And then, the climax, colors churning into vortices, forming constellations of impossible design, mimicking those he had once studied in his astronomy books, but with a terrible and alien wrongness. It was only when he fled these houses, these dream-racked spaces where reality itself frayed at the edges, that the spell would break. Upon stepping back into the cold, indifferent world of Montpelier, his senses would reassemble themselves. His name would return, Jeremy, 19 years old, a resident of Vermont, a trespasser into places best left undisturbed. Yet even in the clarity of waking, the memory of what he had seen would linger, like the afterimage of a too bright light seared into the mind. And he knew, with the slow and creeping horror of revelation, that one day, perhaps soon, he would step into a house and never truly leave. Though his clandestine incursions had long ceased to be mere acts of trespass and had instead become a kind of cosmic exploration, this strange phenomenon did not dissuade Jeremy from his peculiar pursuits. If anything, it only deepened his fascination, compelling him to delve further into the silent and secret depths of uninhabited spaces. The houses called to him, not as mere structures of wood and stone, but as entities unto themselves, as thresholds to some nameless and unfathomable realm. It was on a bitter winter afternoon that Jeremy encountered something which, for the first time in years, gave him pause. He had chosen his target with care, an old solitary dwelling whose lone inhabitant, the reclusive Mr. Dodd, had just departed, doubtless to be gone for hours. Yet as Jeremy stood at a distance, concealed in the twilight shadows of the street's far end, he beheld an impossibility. Every light in the house had flickered to life at once, illuminating its windows like a spectral beacon in the encroaching dusk. A cold prickle ran down his spine. This cannot be, he thought. Mr. Dodd lives alone. He has lived alone for as long as I can remember. He hesitated, a strange and unfamiliar uncertainty creeping into his mind. And then, as if to dismiss his unease, he allowed a smirk to form upon his lips. Perhaps old Dodd has simply forgotten his lady inside. The thought amused him, yet it unsettled him in equal measure. If Mr. Dodd had, indeed, taken a companion, then his house would no longer be an easy conquest. The idea of turning away, of waiting for another time, briefly flitted through Jeremy's mind, but something within him rebelled against such caution. "Don't be a coward," he told himself. "How long has it been since you set foot inside an inhabited house? If memory serves, not since you were 15. The temptation gnawed at him. To enter a house whose silence had been broken, whose stillness was no longer absolute, was this not the next threshold to cross? The next step in his strange and forbidden pilgrimage? And yet, as he stood there, gazing at the impossible glow that radiated from within the house, A strange and nameless thought coiled in the back of his mind, whispering of things that did not belong in the realm of human habitation. At that moment, Jeremy understood with chilling certainty that his clandestine excursions had long since ceased to be mere indulgences of curiosity. They had become an addiction, a compulsion as inexorable as the pull of the tide upon the shore. The sight of the illuminated windows, the undeniable presence of another within Mr. Dodd's house, should have been a deterrent. Yet instead of hesitation, instead of retreat, he felt only an irresistible summons. Something within him, something nameless and insatiable, demanded that he proceed, consequences be damned. Without a second thought, he crossed the street, his breath curling in the cold air, his pulse maddeningly steady. His mind did not waver. His purpose was clear. The house had beckoned, and he would answer. He executed his approach as though the place were as vacant as all the others he had entered before. Slipping into the shadows of the yard, he moved toward the back, where he knew there would be a sliding glass door. As he crept along the side of the house, he passed a window, its pale glow spilling onto the frostbitten ground. A bathroom, most likely. He crouched low, his movements practiced, instinctual. The light from within illuminated the contours of his fingers as they brushed against the icy siding, as though the house itself were painting him in ephemeral strokes of luminescence. Reaching the sliding glass door, he tested it with careful fingers. It slid open effortlessly. A prickle ran along his spine, though he did not allow himself to shudder. Unlocked. Had he truly been so fortunate? Or no? The thought slithered from his mind before he could grasp it. He would not question his luck. He would not dwell on the implication of an open door in a house that should have been locked. And yet, in the silent depths of his thoughts, a whisper curled at the edge of perception, an impossible notion that he dared not fully form. It was as if something had been waiting for him, and had left the door open in anticipation. Upon stepping inside, Jeremy found himself in the dining room, the first chamber to greet him. It was immaculate, unnaturally so. The table stood untouched, the chairs precisely aligned, the air devoid of the lived-in disorder that so often betrayed human presence. Most notably, there were none of those wretched portraits, those leering, glass-eyed effigies of the living and the dead that he had come to despise. There was no trace of inhabitants, no sign of pets. Good, he thought. No yapping curs to chase me out this time. He drifted from room to room, each already bathed in an unearthly glow. Every lamp, every overhead fixture blazed as though in deliberate defiance of the natural order. It was as if someone, or something, had kindled them all in anticipation of his arrival. To welcome him, or to warn him. A sudden sound shattered the hush. A footfall. Presence. Came from the garage. Jeremy's breath caught, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm beneath his skin. His body tensed, his instincts screaming retreat, yet some dreadful curiosity drove him forward. He moved toward the sound, his steps measured, cautious. A thin sheen of cold sweat clung to his brow. They'll catch me this time, he thought. This is it. And yet, deep within his mind, another thought curled and festered, one that he refused to acknowledge. What if I am not the intruder here? Reaching the garage, Jeremy found nothing. No lurking figure, no shadowy presence, only the dim, stagnant air and the mechanical stillness of the place. A twinge of disappointment stirred within him, an irrational sense of anticlimax, as though he had expected something. With a quiet exhale, he turned back toward the dining room. Then he heard it. Not footsteps this time, but a voice, faint, distant, and wrong. It was less a human utterance than a hushed reverberation, a thing on the very threshold of sound. The hairs on his arms rose. He turned sharply to his left, and at that moment, his vision was overtaken by a sudden, violent burst of blue and red light. It struck him, engulfed him. An unseen force seized his body, wrenching him from his bearings, hurling him with terrifying velocity across the dining room. He felt himself dragged, pulled by something vast and unseen, until, crack! His skull met the unyielding surface of a corridor wall. Darkness consumed him. For what might have been moments or an eternity, There was only silence. Then his eyes fluttered open. Jeremy gasped. The house around him was no longer the one he had broken into. It was his house, his childhood home. He could not fathom it. How had he returned here? The thought clawed at his mind, irrational and impossible, yet undeniable. He stood, staggering slightly, and peered around in dazed disbelief. Every detail was precisely as he remembered it. The worn carpet, the familiar scent of aged wood and rain-slick pavement. Nothing had changed, except it was empty. His parents were not there. His sisters were gone. The house stood in silent abandonment, stripped of life. Beyond the windows, the world was wrapped in an unnatural darkness, rain lashing against the glass in relentless sheets. An oppressive weight settled in his chest, a fear unlike any he had ever known. Not the fear of discovery, nor the fear of consequence, but the raw, primal terror of absolute vulnerability. The fear of a child lost in the vastness of an indifferent universe. A cold dread gripped him, and instinctively, he looked down at his hands. They were small. Not the hands of a 19-year-old trespasser, but the frail, delicate hands of an 8-year-old boy. Jeremy's breath hitched. Panic surged through his limbs, and he bolted toward the staircase. His thoughts a chaotic blur of disbelief and terror. He had to see, had to know. He raced up the steps, his feet stumbling in his frantic haste, nearly collapsing as he reached the second floor. The bathroom, he had to reach the bathroom. Somewhere, deep within his mind, a whisper stirred. This is not your home anymore. Inside the bathroom, Jeremy staggered toward the mirror, his breath shallow, his pulse an erratic drumbeat in his ears. The glass held his reflection, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the ghost of relief. Yes, it was him. But something was wrong. The face staring back was not the one he had come to know in his 19 years of life. It was his face, yes, but not as it should have been. The contours were softer, the eyes wide with a boyish innocence that had long since faded. He raised a trembling hand to the glass, and the child in the mirror mimicked his movements with eerie precision. He had regressed. 11 years had unraveled in an instant, twisting time into a cruel, impossible shape. He was once again 8 years old. A wave of helplessness crashed over him. His thoughts spiraled into confusion. How could he explain this? What would he tell his parents? His sisters? How could anyone, even himself, believe what had happened? Jeremy turned away from the mirror, pacing through the empty corridors like a caged animal. The house, his childhood home, stood in pristine familiarity, yet it carried the silent weight of something watching. The air pressed in around him, thick with an unnatural stillness. Then he noticed it. Every single light in the house was on. It had not struck him at first. His panic had drowned out the detail. But now, as he turned in slow, dawning horror, he remembered. He remembered why the lights were on. And that realization sent an icy tendril of dread coiling through his spine. The lights were on because the night outside was a churning abyss of rain and shadow. The wind howled like a starving thing, rattling the windows with skeletal fingers. His parents and sisters had departed hours ago, leaving him alone in the house, adrift in a sea of silence. The lights were on because, in the oppressive stillness of midnight, Jeremy had heard it, the unmistakable sound of something struggling against the back door. A slow, deliberate effort, as if unseen hands, pale and insistent, fumbled at the lock with unnatural persistence. The lights were on because, in that moment of nameless terror, he had torn himself from his bed, heart hammering in his frail chest. He had stumbled through the house, fingers trembling as they flicked on every switch, as if the glow of electric light could hold the encroaching darkness at bay. But even then, deep down, he had known the truth. Light was no defense against the things that lurked beyond the veil of the ordinary. The lights were on because Jeremy had seen an intruder wandering stealthily through the dining room of his house. The lights were on because now Jeremy was being murdered with a knife by that intruder, and as he bled and died, there was nothing he could do, except imagine what his life would have been like if he had turned 19. The end.